First of all, thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Taylor Dominguez. I am the Curriculum Design and Training Specialist here at Arizona State University's Office of Community Health Engagement and Resiliency. Our goal here at OCHR is to co-create interventions with communities that focus on their inherent strengths and assets that promote resiliency. So we provide trainings, webinars like this one today, and technical assistance on evidence-based trauma-informed practices and interventions. And we specifically focus on the community health worker population. So before we get started and introduce our presenter, we wanted to first acknowledge and honor the original caretakers of the land that ASU resides on by sharing this video that is created by ASU's Alliance of Indigenous Peoples. So this is a student-led organization that serves to represent and unite any and all self-identifying Indigenous voices here at ASU. So I'm going to go ahead and share.
Arizona State University is located in Indian country. There are 22 tribal nations in Arizona. ASU's campuses are situated on the homelands of many indigenous peoples, including the Akimel, O'odham, and Peepash.
Arizona State University recognizes the original inhabitants of these lands
and recognizes that they still reside throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area.
And we recognize the impact of their wisdom and generosity towards us.
If you've flown into the valley, you have undoubtedly seen the Salt River Project canals that surround the area.
Those modern-day canals follow the framework of the canals originally constructed by ancestral Sonoran Desert people, Huhulcum, to make this area both livable and a place where peoples could thrive.
We acknowledge that the modern-day indigenous nations that descended from the ancestral peoples are the original inhabitants of this land.
So today our webinar topic is on navigating compassion fatigue while supporting survivors of intimate partner violence, presented by Lauren Fiel. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. We will make sure to answer all of your questions by the end of the presentation. For any other comments, please use the chat function. We also have live Spanish language interpretation that is brought to you by the Tucson Language Justice Collective, and we have two amazing interpreters, Maria and Mari. If you would like to use the Spanish channel, please click on the interpretation button on the Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. So without further ado, I wanted to first just introduce our presenter, and then we'll turn the time over to her. So Lauren is a domestic violence response coordinator at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. In this role, she provides trainings and technical assistance to domestic violence programs and other service providers. Lauren is passionate about LGBTQ+ and BIPOC issues, as well as ensuring that survivors are receiving trauma-informed services. She has worked in the anti-violence movement since 2020 and has experience as an advocate, case manager, and a supervisor in a domestic violence shelter. Lauren is currently pursuing her master's degree in social work at Arizona State University. When she has free time, Lauren enjoys reading, crafting, and spending time outdoors with her partner and their 2 dogs. So I will go ahead and turn the time over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for the introduction. And thank you so much to everyone for having me here today and for coming to this webinar. I'm super excited to be here, especially during October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. And like Taylor mentioned, today we're going to be talking about understanding and addressing compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, specifically when working with survivors of intimate partner violence. So I do just want to touch really briefly on the role of the state coalition. So I do work with the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. Every state and territory has a coalition for domestic and sexual violence. So I noticed some of you are from Washington and from some other states. So your state has a coalition also. In Arizona, we have a dual coalition. Some states have one for domestic violence and one for sexual violence. At ACCV, we advocate for comprehensive responses for domestic and sexual violence survivors at local, state, and national levels. And we also serve as the primary provider of training and technical assistance for organizations that support domestic and sexual violence survivors in Arizona on best practices in programming and administration. And we do public policy advocacy as well. And our mission is to dismantle oppression and promote equity. And Taylor did a great job introducing me, so I don't feel the need to cover this again, but I am, again, just really happy to be here. And so for some housekeeping on my end, as you know, the training will be about an hour and a half long, and I'll make sure I save some time for questions at the end. And there may be times where I ask you questions as well, or just for your thoughts about things. So feel free to always use the chat to share any thoughts that may be coming up for you. And at the very end, there will be an evaluation that I will provide, and that's just really helpful for me to get feedback about this training, if I did a great job, if there's anything I could improve on. So I would just really ask for you to please complete that evaluation at the end. And our objectives for today. So we're going to take a look at how compassion fatigue and secondary trauma show up in victim service professions. We're also going to understand the role of healthy boundaries when working with people and pets who are experiencing trauma. We'll talk a little bit about trauma stewardship and the importance of centering ourselves in trauma work, and examine our current self-care strategies and hopefully add some more strategies to our toolbox. So first, let's take a look at compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress and how that shows up in victim services, specifically domestic violence. First off, we define compassion fatigue as rising from negative responses to occupational experiences working with trauma survivors and undermines efforts to attract, support, and retain a strong workforce over time. And it has been shown to negatively affect service quality, staff well-being, and organizational effectiveness. So that is our working definition. And we know that compassion fatigue can take a physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional toll on people who experience it. So it really, if we're not careful about it, can impact just about every aspect of our lives. So here are some common symptoms of compassion fatigue. One of them is chronic physical and emotional exhaustion. There's also depersonalization, so really just feeling distant or sort of indifferent about the work that you do. This could cause you to feel really removed from the work that you're doing in the community. It could lead to cynicism, maybe a callous type of attitude, or maybe that's directed even towards your coworkers. You start to just kind of distance yourself from the work. There might also be feelings of inequity toward the helping, therapeutic, or caregiver relationship. Irritability is something that commonly happens when someone's experiencing compassion fatigue. If you're not typically an irritable person and you're starting to notice at work or in the work you do in the community that you're becoming irritable much more often, that may be a red flag. Feelings of self-contempt can be a symptom. Difficulty sleeping, or on the flip side, sleeping too much. Weight loss or even weight gain. Headaches, and poor job satisfaction. And this can be, it really impacts, like I said, just about every aspect of our being. But more than that, or in addition to that, it impacts the people that we're serving as well. And what we're here to talk about today is survivors of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And so this can start to impact the people that we serve when it leads to irritability being directed at the survivor, or maybe if you're experiencing some of that depersonalization or indifference about the work, survivors of trauma, they have learned through their traumatic experiences to be very hyper aware. And so they can pick up on these things with us as the people who are serving them. And it can also lead to victim blaming. And, that's a whole separate training. But if we're in this state of, not feeling satisfied with ourselves and our jobs and just the work that we're doing, we can sort of slip into this mindset of victim blaming to sort of ease that compassion fatigue that we're feeling. So that's why it's really important to understand what the symptoms look like and be able to address when you are experiencing compassion fatigue or burnout. So domestic violence advocates can start to develop compassion fatigue through a variety of means. This list is some of the things that advocates are often exposed to that can lead to compassion fatigue. Of course, they're frequently exposed to trauma material. They might have their own history of trauma, right? This field of work, whether you're a domestic violence advocate or a community health worker, really any type of helping profession, most people go into this work because of something they've experienced in their own lives and that desire to help others. Unfortunately, though, that also puts us at risk for compassion fatigue. We listen to people's stories, we read cases about violence. Sometimes, depending on the type of work we do, we may witness violence. You might work a hotline. You witness the suffering of others on a regular basis. And maybe you even feel responsible for someone's safety or well-being. Sexual violence advocates also are regularly exposed to the suffering of others. Again, they may have their own history of trauma. They're constantly bearing witness to other people's suffering and pain. And I'm sure many of you can relate to these things, right? They're continually offering support and compassion, navigating incredibly challenging systems, that might make you feel like you have nothing to give or that you can't change things. And again, these are all things that are exposures that put people at a risk of developing that compassion fatigue. And then we have vicarious or secondary trauma. So secondary trauma is a term used to describe the negative psychological consequences that people in the helping profession, such as victim advocacy, may experience as a result of being exposed to a survivor's accounts of trauma and witnessing the survivor's pain and suffering. So this is similar to compassion fatigue, but what's different is that with secondary trauma, it's more than just feeling fatigued. At this point, you yourself, as the helping professional, are experiencing trauma because of the work that you're doing. And about 70 to 80% of advocates have identified as suffering from secondary trauma. And I'm sure many of you, being people that work within your communities, may also identify as experiencing secondary trauma. It's something that is incredibly common when you're working with people that have gone through some of the worst things that a person can go through. So it is, like I said, though, a little bit different from burnout or compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue typically tends to happen slowly, right? You've been doing this work for a while, caring for others, being incredibly empathetic, and it slowly starts to take a toll on you. It's that slow depletion of mental and physical resources. You might start to experience that pessimism, cynicism, job dissatisfaction, downing your core beliefs, and of course that chronic fatigue. That's kind of, that characteristic of compassion fatigue. However, this can be prevented or even treated by taking time off. If it's something that's incredibly severe, some people switch jobs or even entire careers. But this is something that is preventable or treatable. Now, when we talk about vicarious or secondary trauma, this is something that can happen quickly, right? It can just be one story that you listen to that just hits you in such a way that it is traumatic for you. Maybe because of your own life experiences, it's a little bit less predictable. With this type of secondary stress reaction, a person is suffering from trauma symptoms without experiencing firsthand trauma. So they aren't being harmed directly. Nothing unsafe has happened, but because of the work that they're doing with traumatized people, they start to experience trauma symptoms themselves. They might start to avoid triggers of somebody else's trauma that's not their own. So it is much different than compassion fatigue in that way. It can occur through listening, seeing, or consuming media. It's often accompanied by guilt, and it can be treated, whether that is through therapy or other types of healing practices. But it can't necessarily be prevented, right? Unlike compassion fatigue or burnout. And we also can't have a conversation about vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue for that matter without talking about current affairs. Because especially us as helping professionals, we spend all day, invested in other people's suffering and trauma, and that can take a toll on us. But then when we come home and we see things on the news about global warming or global pandemics, mass shootings, violence in our communities, and we are empathetic people, right? That just contributes to the compassion fatigue that we're feeling, but it can also be causing some vicarious trauma. Even thinking about 9/11, people who didn't experience 9/11, who were not in New York when it happened, but maybe saw it on TV. That can certainly be traumatizing, even if they weren't experiencing any direct trauma themselves. And the same thing goes for what we see on the news every day now. So, what does vicarious trauma feel like? It might feel like hopelessness, things are never going to get better, things will never change, or even consistent feelings of helplessness, like there's nothing I can do to help this person. What's the point in trying? Vicarious trauma also has the power to impact and change a person's entire worldview or previously held belief system. So the way that I often see this kind of manifest in domestic violence work is, let's say you're working with victims of intimate partner violence, and largely the people that are causing harm are men. And so you are consistently hearing stories about how men have abused these victims and just horrendous, awful things that men are capable of doing to people that they claim to love. That can really impact your own worldview. Maybe you start to have this belief that all men are abusers or that no man is safe, rather than, the understanding that, yes, people of any gender, including men, can be abusers and can be, people that cause harm, but it doesn't mean that every single man is abusive or that good men don't exist. So, it has that power to change your entire worldview. And folks experiencing vicarious trauma may even start to question the meaning of life. Like, what is my purpose here? Or can we actually change things? Especially when we're talking about huge issues like domestic violence or oppression, right? So what are the outcomes of vicarious trauma? Folks experiencing vicarious trauma may experience changes to their cognitive schemas like trust, safety, power, esteem, intimacy, independence, and frame of reference. So your entire ideas about what safety looks like, that may change when you have experienced vicarious trauma. And what's interesting is that if you're experiencing symptoms of vicarious trauma and you go see a therapist, vicarious trauma is not a diagnosis that you would receive, but it's more of a phenomenon that people experience. However, some people that are experiencing vicarious trauma may be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder if the symptoms that they're experiencing are incredibly severe, are impacting their day-to-day lives. But that is a common diagnosis that people working with survivors of violence have because of this vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue that they experience. And there's also a community impact of vicarious trauma. And although vicarious trauma is not something that any of us want to experience, it kind of does help us to understand that we're part of a collective and that what harms one of us has effects on many of us. So it sort of drives home this point of the importance of community. And understanding vicarious trauma provides us the language and tools to understand how collective suffering from a traumatic event happens, what happens, and how we can manage that through community. And I just want to take a second here and ask, what are your thoughts on this sort of collective or community impact of vicarious trauma? Feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. you maybe experienced this yourself, you know, how vicarious trauma really has an impact on the community as a whole, or how one person's trauma can impact a whole community. So I see one comment that says being fearful. Yeah, maybe an entire community might start to be fearful, or, you know, if you're working in your community and you're working with survivors of violence, you might start to be fearful of your own community because of some of those worldview changes or changes in your cognition. Yeah. Well, thank you for putting some thoughts in the chat. So essentially, when we have burnout and secondary traumatic stress combined, that is pretty much going to take us to that point of compassion fatigue, right? And we'll talk a little bit about some more risk and protective factors specifically for compassion fatigue. So specifically for domestic and sexual violence advocates or people that work with survivors, we have several protective factors for compassion fatigue. Interestingly, research has shown that older age is a protective factor, as well as trauma-informed practices with the organization when there's shared power between not only supervisors and staff, but also clients. When staff's roles are clearly defined and their expectations are clearly defined, that is a protective factor. When the agency supports efforts to promote staff well-being, there is less compassion fatigue, and also having the opportunity for supportive supervision. And then we also have risk factors. So having a high workload is a risk factor, right? Especially for burnout that might lead to compassion fatigue, poor supervision, when the organizational climate is unsupportive. If someone has previous trauma specifically related to intimate partner violence or sexual violence, that can be a risk factor for compassion fatigue. It's not to say that people with previous trauma could not go into this work, but they may have to just take some additional steps to ensure that they're caring for themselves, right? Just as much as they're caring for others. Experiencing current personal stressors can really be a risk factor for compassion fatigue. You know, maybe that's having a health concern come up, or maybe unexpectedly having to step into a caretaker role. And research has also shown that being exposed to microaggressions in the workplace is also increases advocates' experiences of compassion fatigue. So there are some ways that compassion fatigue can be combated from an organizational standpoint. One of those protective factors was having trauma-informed organizational practices. But what does that really look like? So a trauma-informed organization really emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety of not only survivors and clients, but staff as well, with the aim of helping trauma survivors restore a sense of control and empowerment. They seek to holistically address workplace factors that contribute to occupational stress, including compassion fatigue. They acknowledge the scope and scale of trauma and are also knowledgeable of potential healing options. They recognize indicators of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others within systems. And what's really important here is recognizing indicators of trauma in staff, because if the organization can see those signs of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue, they can step in and, support that person as best they can. That's one of the things that I love about trauma-informed practice models, because the staff are just as much, as equally as important to the organization as the client. And trauma-informed organizations also proactively respond by systematically incorporating knowledge of trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And they resist re-traumatization of clients and staff alike. So before we move on, I just want to take a moment and ask if there's any questions thus far that I can answer before we start talking about pets. All right, I don't see any questions, so we will move on. So now we're going to also talk about compassion fatigue in pet welfare spaces. And I know you're probably like, why are we talking about pets in a training about domestic violence? But you'll come to understand. So when we're talking about specifically pet welfare spaces, compassion fatigue is emotional exhaustion caused by the stress of caring for traumatized or suffering animals or people. And it is found among the animal rescue community's underserved, underappreciated, and uncomplaining caregivers. But why are we talking about this? Why is it important to bring pets into this conversation? Well, 70% of US households own a pet. That is over 90 million homes. And specifically when we're thinking of community health workers, I'm sure many of you are going into homes, right, to work with your community. So 70% of those homes you're going into have a pet. During the pandemic, really the peak time of the pandemic, 1 in 5 households acquired a new dog or cat. And in 1988, only 56% of US households owned a pet. So we've seen a major increase, in the last few decades. And it's incredibly vital that we bring pets into this conversation. Another reason why we have to talk about pets is because pets are inextricably linked to family violence. There have been multiple studies on this intersection between animal cruelty and family violence, and they've shown that these two things co-occur from anywhere between 25 to 89% of the time. And women also report that the people that are causing them harm, who are also abusing their pets, when compared to those who did not, were less likely to consider pets as sentient beings or members of the family, and more likely to view pets as property. And acts or threats of animal cruelty often coerce, control, and intimidate women, children, and elders to be silent about their abuse, to prevent them from leaving, or to force them to return. So what is the link here? You can see that animal abuse, child maltreatment, elder abuse, and domestic violence all overlap. When there is animal abuse happening in a home, there are very likely chances that child abuse is occurring or intimate partner violence is occurring as well. Animal abuse is also used to threaten human victims. Going back to what we know about domestic violence, it's all about maintaining that power and control over another person. And unfortunately, because people that cause harm understand how important our pets are to us, they're used as a tool to maintain that power and control. Animal violence may also predict future violence. So if someone is abusing an animal, that may be a sign that they may harm humans in the future. And the co-occurrence of multiple forms of violence is going to increase future violence, right? If you're seeing, 2 or 3 types of violence, they sort of just perpetuate each other. And lastly, animal abuse is used to prevent families from leaving the home. Because again, people understand how we love our pets, how important they are to us. So that makes them a really effective tool to prevent people from leaving. 71% of pet-owning women report that their abuser has injured, maimed, killed, or threatened family pets. That's a very large amount. And up to 40% of sexual and domestic violence survivors delay their decision to seek safety and services out of fear for their animal's welfare. That is also a very large number of people that are remaining in danger because they love their animal and are fearing for their welfare. And so what is the intersection? Why is this important in a training about compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma? Well, in Arizona, there are 14 domestic violence programs that provide on-site pet housing and 4 that provide pet-inclusive services. And advocates in every single one of these programs are being exposed to trauma and suffering of not just people, but animals as well. And community health workers and outreach professionals who visit survivors in their communities or homes are also being exposed. If you're someone who provides services to people in their homes, like I said, 70% of those homes likely have a pet. And if there's intimate partner violence occurring, chances are likely that there's animal abuse occurring as well. And all of this increases our risk of compassion fatigue. Animal abuse especially, as humans, we are also still animals, right? And our nervous system responds to threats from other humans and animals as well. So when we're seeing animals in danger, that activates our own threat response system. So it's important to learn about this intersection, not just for people in your community that you're serving, but also yourself. So we're always going to be impacted by the work we do, right? None of us go into this work because it's easy or because we don't care. So we're always going to be impacted by it. But one of the things we can do to really sustain ourselves in this incredibly challenging, but also incredibly rewarding work is set healthy boundaries. And I love this quote by Brené Brown, that daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. And with that, we are going to watch a short video about boundaries.
Hello and welcome back to Prevention Connection. Today's video will cover boundaries, what they are, how we set them, and how we can make sure to stick to them once they're in place. Let's first break down what a boundary is. Boundaries are the limits and invisible lines we set for ourselves. They are the guidelines on what we feel comfortable with and the expectations we have of the people we interact with. Boundaries can be present in all aspects of our lives. They can do a lot to make our lives more balanced. They help keep our relationships and selves healthy, enable us to make ourselves a priority, and help others understand our needs. For example, a healthy boundary to have with our friends is to be respectful of each other's values. Chances are, you and your friends will disagree sometimes. For example, I value time, and my friends are often late to events and don't care if it bothers me. A boundary I'd set is telling them how it makes me feel and asking them to respect my time. A healthy friendship allows people to prioritize different things and maintain respect. Boundaries are personal to us. They can be shaped by many things like culture, where we live, our personality type, our life experiences, and our family. But how do we know what boundaries to set? Well, you can pay attention to how certain people and situations make you feel. Situations or people that make you feel unsafe, overwhelmed, or make you want to avoid them should be acknowledged and respected. Respecting ourselves and acknowledging our rights is critical to setting healthy boundaries. Make a list of key values that are important to you, such as I have a right to say no without feeling guilty, be treated with respect, make my needs as important as others, be accepting of my mistakes and failures, and I have a right not to meet others' unreasonable expectations of me. Once we have figured out what our boundaries are, how do we set them? Be assertive. Use clear I statements to communicate what you need. Learn to say no and do not feel the need to justify your no. Get help if needed. As we mentioned, some boundaries are tricky, especially when they are dealing with dangerous situations such as addiction or mental health issues. Although they are difficult to set at first, boundaries are great tools to help keep us safe and healthy. Boundaries are not only for us, they also help us respect the space and needs of others. We can respect other people's boundaries by listening when they tell us what they need. Being mindful if someone appears uncomfortable. One way to do this is looking for cues such as avoiding eye contact, turning away, limited conversation response, nervous gestures like laughing, talking fast, folding arms, stiffening posture, or flinching. And if you are still unsure if they're uncomfortable, ask. Create a safe space for them to express their discomfort and boundaries with you. There will come a time where your boundaries will be tested. Someone does something that you are not comfortable with, or you're put in a situation where you feel obligated to violate a boundary you have set for yourself. Prepare for these difficult situations and how you want to respond. Boundaries are the limits we set for ourselves. It is up to us to decide what they are and when we set them. We hope you found this video helpful. If you would like additional resources on healthy boundaries.
All right, so I hope that video was a good introduction to this conversation about boundaries. And boundaries are not always easy to set and maintain, right? Especially when we're used to constantly giving so much of ourselves to helping other people. Boundaries can be very challenging, but it is something that is incredibly vital for us to be able to really just sustain ourselves so that we can do this work for a long time without feeling burnt out or developing compassion fatigue. So I want to talk about a few types of boundaries and how we can set these in the workplace. So one of them is physical boundaries. This might include not working on weekends or not being on call over a certain amount of hours at a time. So, being physical about your physical time, or it could include not wanting to shake hands or hug others in the workplace. So physical as in your body. There's also emotional boundaries. So that might include not engaging in toxic or negative conversations, or not allowing others to influence you into going against your own personal beliefs. And then we have spiritual boundaries. So in the workplace, this could look like setting aside time in your day that is devoted to meditation or prayer, or even just quiet time with no interruptions, or not participating in conversations that criticize your core values. And so these are just some really quick examples. And I do see a few things in the chat, so I'm just going to check that. Oh, I see a question about sharing the link to the boundary video. I will make sure that Taylor has a copy of these slides as well as the link to the video to be able to share them with you. Thank you for that question. So I really like this boundary model by Nina Brown. And with this model, there are 4 different types of boundaries. There are soft boundaries, which are easily molded to fit others, and this can easily be subject to coercion or manipulation. Then there are rigid boundaries. These are sort of the opposite. These are boundaries that are completely walled off due to a previous bad experience or even abuse. Spongy boundaries are inconsistent, kind of a combination between soft and rigid. And then there's flexible boundaries. This would be the ideal use of a boundary. They are protected and enforced, but they're also set knowingly and intentionally and not as a result of trauma. So to give you some examples, a soft boundary might look like, I told my supervisor that I'm unable to cover overnight shifts, but I always end up covering them anyways when they make me feel guilty for saying no. So this boundary is easily subjected to coercion or manipulation, or just molded by what others are saying. You know, they feel guilty, so they're gonna just really easily go back on their boundary. A rigid boundary, which is kind of the opposite, might look like, the last time I worked an overnight shift, 2 participants' dogs got into a fight and I had to intervene. Because of this, I will never cover an overnight shift again, and I don't care what anyone says to try to convince me. So this is completely walled off. There is no room for flexibility at all. And this boundary is also shaped by a previous bad experience. So then we have a spongy boundary. This might look like, I told my supervisor that because of my previous bad experience, I would never work an overnight shift again, no matter the circumstances. However, when my colleague told me how desperately they needed the coverage, I ended up signing up to work the shift anyways. So it starts off as a rigid boundary, right? Because of that bad experience, I am never doing this again, no matter what. But it was also still, easily manipulated or coerced to that person going back on their boundary. So it was soft in that way. And then we have a flexible boundary. And this might look like, I know that I have a hard time staying awake all night. So I told my supervisor that I'm not able to work overnight shifts. However, I know that there might be rare times where I need to cover a shift, and my supervisor knows that I should be one of the last people they ask. So this boundary is not shaped by a previous bad experience. It's something that is set intentionally based on this person's own knowledge of themselves and their preferences. It's very conscious. But at the same time, you know, they understand that there may be very rare times where they do have to be flexible and work that shift. But this has been communicated to others and is honored by their supervisor whenever possible. So what might the process look like of setting a boundary? Because again, this is not necessarily easy to do. Especially for people who are used to helping others and giving all of themselves all the time. So the first thing to do is to identify your limits. Really give yourself the time and mindful space to reflect on what you are comfortable with and what you're not. This might include your working hours, how many people are on your caseload, or even the amount of time that you spend on specific tasks. So maybe to start this off, you know, write a list of things that you know you're comfortable with or that you're not, and maybe what you feel like you need to be safe and supported. then you want to communicate your boundaries. Communicate them clearly to your colleagues, clients, and leaders. And be respectful, but also assertive when explaining why you're setting these boundaries. And then you have to stick to them, right? So once you have your boundaries, it's important to stick to them. By respecting your own boundaries, you'll be sending a message to others that your time and energy are valuable, while also having that stability and control over your own life. And like it was mentioned in the video, there will be a time where our boundaries are tested or crossed. So knowing how you'll respond when a boundary is crossed is going to increase that chance of you maintaining the boundary, rather than having those soft boundaries that are easily subjected to manipulation. And if you don't have a prepared response, it's a lot easier for someone to convince you to change your boundary or even make a compromise that you're not comfortable with. And then perhaps most importantly, you need to practice self-care. Setting boundaries is only part of it, but practicing self-care is essential for your physical, emotional, and mental health. And we know that we're capable of great things when we establish behaviors that promote holistic well-being. And I'm going to bring pets into this again, because if we're talking about boundaries, we also have to talk about boundaries with pets. So if you do encounter pets because of your work, what do your boundaries look like when you have to interact with them? Have you spent time considering what you are and are not comfortable with when it comes to working with animals? And have you communicated this to your colleagues and leaders? You know, maybe you can't go into homes that have cats, or you're not comfortable with dogs jumping on you when you go into a home. These are things to really consider, and you know, if you need to set some boundaries around them, do that. And boundaries are incredibly important for helping advocates manage their emotional well-being, maintain their energy levels, prevent burnout, and avert compassion fatigue. But beyond that, boundaries can help advocates maintain a sense of their own personal values and morals. Like I've said several times, advocates and community health workers and really any type of helping professional is immensely passionate about their work. And of course, they're going to be emotionally invested. No one chooses to stay in this type of career field without that intensity and dedication, right? But to keep advocates that genuinely have the capacity for this incredibly important work, whether it's domestic violence work or really any type of community health work, boundaries for ourselves are essential to keep that fire within us from slowly burning out. Another way that we can do this is through trauma stewardship, and specifically trauma stewardship as self-care. So trauma stewardship refers to the entire conversation about how we come to do the work, how we are affected by it, and how we make sense of and learn from our experiences. It also is about being fully present with others' pain, trauma, and suffering without taking it on as our own. It is a long-term approach to tending to our own wholeness so we can be helpful to others in our full integrity. And this is sort of a lot. You know, this isn't something that is going to come easily. This requires deep inner work for each of us to identify what it is that we need and to be diligent in practicing, not just for ourselves, but for those that we serve, right? Because our self-care, you know, like I mentioned in the very beginning, especially people that have been through trauma, that are experiencing that hypervigilance, they can tell when we are not showing up as our full selves and having that full integrity when we come to do this work. So we want to do it for ourselves, but also for the people in our community as well. This means exploring our own values and our purpose, our feelings and emotions, our past experiences, especially if they've led us to do this work, and what meanings we make of that. So you can sort of see how this falls in line with boundaries, right? These are both very connected to really exploring yourself and your values and what that means for the work that you do. There's a book called Trauma Stewardship, and there's also an agency called the Trauma Stewardship Institute. So the authors of Trauma Stewardship recommend this compass of well-being, and this is tied to several indigenous spiritual traditions. So you can see that there's 4 different directions, and integrating these practices into daily rituals and routines means that we're not only engaging in these things when we feel like we need to, or we're feeling particularly burnt out that day, but instead these are daily practices that we commit to and integrate into how we're living our lives. So in the North, we have creating space for inquiry. We can do this by sitting in silence, by maybe meditation, taking time away, whether that is during the workday, going for a walk, or even taking some time off if you need to, practicing our breathing, maybe going to therapy, or even personal coaching, really investing in some sort of spiritual practice, and also personal reflection. So a lot of these are just daily practices that create that space to ask those questions. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Is trauma mastery a factor for me? And is this working for me? And really just exploring yourself and your values. Then going to the east, which is choosing our focus. This part of the compass is really about shifting away from reaction to response. So having agency in where our focus is, what our attention is on. And that doesn't necessarily mean avoiding, hard things or the tough stuff or pretending that everything is okay. But it's more about radically accepting reality and choosing intentionally what our response will be. In the South, that's about cultivating relationships. That might be with friends or family, but also connecting with your community. And this might start at a micro level within your household and go all the way to a macro level, maybe the global community. So this piece of the compass is really about engaging in action to make someone's life a little better, or maybe to make the world better, and just everything in between. And I'm sure this is something that most of you have probably already mastered, right? Because you're all helping professionals. And then lastly, the West is about finding balance. So we know that our work, the support that we give to people experiencing trauma, our commitments to social justice, all of these are incredibly important. However, if we're not also creating space to figure out what we need and to take time to replenish ourselves, we're really undermining our own effectiveness in that work. And not just in our work, but every other aspect of our lives as well. You're not an infinite commodity, right? You are a renewable resource, and you have to take steps and actions to renew yourself, to be renewed. So that's kind of what trauma stewardship is all about, really creating that daily practice of centering yourself so that you can support people experiencing trauma, experiencing intimate partner violence, while still having yourself as the center. And you can renew yourself by focusing on holistic well-being. And this is about investing in yourself in all areas of your life: mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, interpersonal relationships, and also workplace relationships. So here are some ideas, things that you might consider doing if you're not already, or maybe hearing these things will help you or inspire you to think of your own ideas for some self-care. And when I say self-care, I'm not just talking about taking a bubble bath. That can certainly be self-care. Sometimes we need to come home and have that bubble bath. But this is more about really finding out our values and exploring ways that we can truly create that holistic well-being. So mentally, maybe you like to read books, and maybe not necessarily only books that are related to your profession. I work a lot in mental health, so I do enjoy reading books about mental health or about how trauma can impact people throughout their lifetime. But that's not necessarily me renewing myself, right? I might renew myself by reading a fiction book or a nonfiction book that I have never learned anything about before, to really take my mind off the work that I do every day. You could listen to self-development podcasts, maybe take a class, and I'm not talking about, enrolling in college, although that could be something, but maybe take a cooking class or a pottery class, just do something different. Allow yourself to not be an expert. Allow yourself to be a beginner in something. And also, don't undermine the effectiveness of taking a social media break, especially for your mental well-being. And especially with all the things happening right now, just globally, internationally, that can be exhausting. We talked about how current affairs can really play a role in us developing compassion fatigue. So if you need to take a social media break for a few days or a week, it's okay to give yourself permission to do that. And then spiritually, spiritual doesn't necessarily mean religion, right? You don't have to be religious to be spiritual. You can spend time in nature. That can be a spiritual practice. Having a yoga practice, meditating or praying, and also making your space a sanctuary. And what I mean by this is, if there's a space, whether it's your bedroom or your office, that you spend a lot of your time in, really invest in making that space a sanctuary for yourself, this calming, nice, relaxing space that's really easy on your nervous system, so that when you walk into that room, you're like, okay, this is my space. I'm calm, I feel safe here. That can be a form of spiritual well-being. And then we have emotional. One of the ways that you can invest in emotional well-being is developing your language vocabulary. Developing your feelings vocabulary. And what I mean by that is, if someone asks you how you're feeling, a lot of times our sort of default responses are happy, sad, angry, but there are a lot more words for feelings. Are you feeling angry, or are you feeling frustrated or afraid or maybe betrayed or belittled? Really take the time and sit with yourself. And if someone asks you, how are you? And you're like, oh, I'm okay. Dig a little deeper. What are the emotions that you're truly experiencing? This will allow you to know yourself better, but also allow others to know you better as well. You might consider going to therapy. You know, even if you're not currently experiencing compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, it's never a bad thing to just have a place to process things that are going on. If you struggle particularly with the aspect of your job that has to do with pets, you know, if you're going into homes where there's pets and you're struggling particularly with that aspect, or knowing that there's a pet that's being harmed and you can't really do a lot about it, maybe consider adopting a pet, you know, not even just for that, but for the companionship that pets bring us. Or if you already have a pet, maybe spend some additional time with them. You might create art. Art truly is emotional, right? When we're listening to music, or when we go to an art museum and look at the paintings or the photographs, none of that was just created just because, right? There is emotion tied to it. So maybe for you, creating art is a way to express that emotion. Or similarly, journaling. And then there's physical well-being. Of course, diet and nutrition play a role in this. You know, maybe take some time to really consider if, you know, how you're fueling your body and what feels right for you. Hydration is incredibly important. You can also invest in yourself physically by getting regular wellness checks. You know, if you haven't gotten a checkup in 5-10 years, you know, schedule a checkup just to really care for your body, to give back to your body. There's yoga and stretching, and you can see how some of these sort of overlap with others. Like yoga can also be a spiritual practice. And then there's also sleep hygiene. You know, are you getting enough sleep every night? What does your bedtime routine look like? These are all ways that you can really pour back into yourself in a physical way. And then lastly, we have relationships. You might prioritize being in community. If you're a community health worker, this might be something that leads you to feel more burnt out. So if it does, maybe you don't do this. Prioritize spending time maybe in the community in your house. Tell others how you feel, hold your boundaries, and also reach out when you need to. You know who those people are that you can reach out to. And so I'll end with this quote that I absolutely love. The greatest gift you can give somebody is your own personal development. I used to say, if you will take care of me, I will take care of you. Now I say, I will take care of me for you if you will take care of you for me. And finally, I just have some resources to leave you with. This first one, RAF, stands for Resilience for Advocates through Foundational Training. They provide support specifically for sexual and domestic violence advocates. They do workshops and trainings about self-care and resilience. I mentioned Trauma Stewardship. It's a book that you can read, but there's also the Trauma Stewardship Institute that has trainings and toolkits on their website. The ASU Office of Community Health Engagement and Resiliency, which is who has brought us all together today, they have a lot of great self-care resources on their website. And lastly, ASSDV, where I work. You know, if you are looking for some domestic violence or sexual violence specific resources or self-care resources, you can always reach out to us, and we are more than happy to provide that. And so that is all I have for you today. We do have some time for questions, so I would love to answer any questions that you have. Oh, I do see a question about the name of the book. Let me go back. It's Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. The authors is Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky and Connie Burke. And this book was written specifically for anyone who is doing work to make the world a better place. It's not specific to domestic and sexual violence. It's really just for anyone who's working with suffering people or, any type of helping profession. And then I'm also going to put the link to the evaluation in the chat. Like I mentioned, I would really, really appreciate it if you could fill this out. It really does mean a lot to me. I do take the feedback very seriously and implement feedback. So I would just really appreciate that. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions that you might have or any comments that you have. We do have some time.